All right, so for part 2 of the series, what we'll look at is taking that data that we have imported from those systems now and actually using it to create a filter to find, in our case here, who needs to be created. So remember back that on the first episode, what we did was we actually set up our Active Directory system. We set up our employees CSV being imported. We set up some configurations around those. And then we also set up an inter-system relationship between those systems so that we know that, hey, this record inside the employees CSV in this case, is the owner or should be considered the owner of this particular account inside of Active Directory. So with that inter-system relationship created, what we can do is now start to ask NIM questions around different combinations of that join. So we'll start off by going into the filters tab here. And what we're going to do is create a new filter. Now the naming convention here is not really important. I'm going to reference the user type, the system, and the action that we want. All right, so I'm going to call mine employee 80 user create. We'll go ahead and hit create here, and we're taken into the filter screen. So there's two major portions of this. On the top side of the screen, we have the filter specification, and on the lower half here, we're going to have a data set that's coming back as well as some configuration options on these different tabs. So we'll look at a couple of these here as we move through. So the goal of this filter is I want to ask NIM a question. In this case, tell me who needs to have an AD account created, meaning that the user does not have an account created yet. So if we think about that question, what we're really trying to query from NIM is I'm asking for a list of all of the employees. So this seems like a fairly good spot to start from with our filter here. I want to start from all of our users, and I want to filter this down further to say, give me only the records out of this table that don't have an Active Directory account yet. And so in order to do that, what I want to select is I'm going to add a logical AND section here. This is going to put a little AND block for us to work from, and we'll see why in just a moment. But what I first want to do is I want to say, give me all of the employee users that do not have an Active Directory account. So in order to do that, we're going to use this relation filter item here. So this little chain link looking icon. If we click one of those, it's going to pop up and it's going to give us the option to select what kind of system we want to join against. So in this case, we want to select our AD user objects, right? And you'll see that it gave us a little alias over here, and this will be important later on. But we don't want all of the employees that have an AD account. So instead, what we want is no AD account, right? So if I were to kind of read this, almost in like pseudocode, it would be look at all of our employee users and find me only the ones that have no Active Directory user objects associated with them. Okay. And this relationship that we're looking at here, this is directly a benefit inside of NIM from that inter-system relationship that we set up in the previous video. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and we'll go ahead and run the filter really quick. So what we're seeing in the lower half here is these are our 9 records that we saw in the CSV. So we have all 9 people that need to come through and have an account created. A couple things that we want to try and fix up though. So one of them right away is you may have noticed that we have a couple of users here that actually have a status of inactive. In most cases, we're probably going to assume that an inactive user shouldn't actually have an Active Directory account, right? And so in our case here in this particular data set, this is very clear, right? We have one field that tells us whether or not somebody is or isn't active. But we may, in more of a realistic data set, we may have 3 or 4, or a much more complicated scenario that we want to model. And all of those are still going to be valid within NIM. It's just a matter of being able to define out that there are specific columns that we need to check or maybe specific values that we need to check for. So in our case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to our AND here, right? So I want to add more conditions underneath of this AND condition. And so what I can do is now I want to add an expression item. So what we want to do is we want to filter out anybody in this data set where their status is set to inactive. Or maybe a better way of thinking about that is I want only the records that have a status of active, right? So that way, if we had, say, other statuses that came in the future, I don't need to worry about that, right? I'm saying I only want active status users to be in this filter. So we'll add a new expression item here, and this has a little bit different layout than we saw with the join, but what I'm going to do is select my field that I want to evaluate. In this case, I want to do status, and I'm going to do, this is just a text field, so we can actually just relate this as like a static value or a static string. So I'm going to do equals and CI, meaning case insensitive, and I'm going to put in active here. So with that said, we can go ahead and hit filter again, and we've dropped down to just 7 records. So we see those 2 inactive records disappear from the results set. One other thing that I want to address here as well is that we have a lot of columns, if I were to scroll over, a lot of columns that are coming from the Active Directory users table, but they're all blank, right? So these are all users that don't have an AD account, and so none of these fields over here are actually going to have values in there. They don't really provide us a benefit. And so what we can do to kind of narrow down the data that is in this filter or returned by this filter is go into our column selection, and I'm just going to simply uncheck the users 01 set of values here. So, and again, remember that users 01, this is that alias that came from our AD users object or AD users table. All right, so with all of that said, we'll go back to the data tab here. We'll go ahead and click filter one more time, and there we go. We have kind of our finalized data set. So what this is telling me is of all of the data coming in that CSV, as long as that user is active and they do not have an Active Directory account yet, then they will show up in this filter, and we can use this data now in NIM to go and create an Active Directory account or whatever target system that we may be wanting to connect to. So let's go back to the filters here. Now, when we look at Active Directory, and this is the case for most directory systems especially, there are going to be things like unique fields that we need to be able to generate, or we need to be able to maybe find the next iteration of. So in Active Directory, a lot of those things come down to SAM account name, user principal name or UPN, CN to some extent, or the name field. And there's oftentimes a couple other ones that we need to work around. But primarily for this series, what we're going to look at is the SAM account name, the UPN, and the CN. In order to do that, though, we need to tell NIM how to actually go about creating NameGen. And so we actually have this name generation tab over here that we're going to walk into. We also have a password generation one that we'll look at here in just a second. The name generators, this is a way or a method that we can have NIM utilize to generate different names as the name of this particular object or this feature may imply. So just like the filters, we'll go ahead and create a new one. And again, the name structure here is not important. I like to denote them as being some sort of name generator, just so that way later on in NIM, in dropdowns and everything like that, it's very obvious what this is meant to be. So I'm just going to call mine NG employees. We'll go ahead and create our name generator. So this screen is going to be a little bit more busy than we saw on any of the previous screens. But as we kind of go through this, I think the little sections here will start to make a lot more sense. Now, the way that a name generator works is that this is based off of the data that comes from a filter. So you can think of that data set that we were getting from our user create filter here. I'm going to go ahead and select that, and we're going to see those columns show up in this kind of lower left-hand side. We can also use the arrow keys to actually scroll through these users and see some preview data here as well. And this will be helpful as we're building our logic out in just a moment to kind of see and get a feel for what would it look like for this particular user, or what would the next iteration look like for a particular user's account. All right, so we have our data that we can work with, and now we have two different areas that we're seeing over here on the right, names and methods. And what the name gen is going to do is we can tell this name generator, I want you to construct a variable that has a set of methods or set of iterations that it should step through, right? So generally speaking, we're going to create a new name for every one of those attributes that we want to populate in our directory system. So again, same account name, UPN, CN, so on and so forth. We'd create an individual name for each one of those. So I'm going to start by creating the same account name, and we'll actually be able to kind of copy and paste this one as we go through. So this will be the long one, and then the rest of them will be a little bit shorter. So I'm going to call this again kind of ng as the prefix, and I'm going to call this same account name. All right, so we have our name created here, and what we can do now is start to add methods to this. So when I create a new user account, I need to say, here's what their username should be, and if there was a conflict, let's say we have, we'll use John Smith as an example here. If there was another John Smith, what am I going to change the second person's username to be so that there isn't a conflict? Is it going to be, John.Smith and then John.Smith2 as the secondary account, or do we want to introduce other variables or other values into the name, right? And so we have a large amount of flexibility here inside of NIM to construct different parts and use different conversion methods that we'll talk about here in just a moment to adjust these values and even sanitize some of these values. So we'll start off, and I'm just going to add one method into each of these names. In our case, we're actually going to use the employee ID or the user ID's value in their username. And this means that we won't have any actual conflicts. And that's just to make sure this video doesn't end up being, 30 or 40 minutes long, going through all the different scenarios that we could run into. All right, so we have method 0 created here, or index 0 for our methods. And what we need to do is drag and drop the column names here from the left side into these part columns. So I'm going to use first.last and then the employee's ID as our kind of structure here. But as you'll see, there's a lot of conversions that we can apply to those to adjust those values. Maybe we want something like first initial last name instead. So I'm going to start with first name, and I'm going to pull that over into part 1. And something immediate shows up, right? We see the value up here in our names reflect that. And we also see down here in the results window that this has now changed. So by default, this is going to show us the first 15 attempts or 15 iterations and what that value is going to look like each time. So if the second time we created Jim Brown here, this is what we're going to see for that particular iteration. We also are going to need their last name and their ID. So I'm going to grab their last name into part 2, and then I'm going to grab their ID into part 3. And so as you can kind of see down here in the results window, these are just being concatenated together. There's no punctuation, there's no formatting, nothing. There's no spaces being included on any of that. If we want to introduce those rules, we need to use conversion methods. So I'm going to select the last name field here, so part 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check a box here for add at begin. And what this does is allows us to provide an argument, and it's going to take that value and place it at the beginning of this value. So in our case, we want to do first name dot last name. So I'll put a period there, and we can see in the results that now it is Jim.Brown and then our ID number. So there's a huge number of these conversion methods. So as you can see, there's a lot of kind of order of operations, adjustments that you could make here to really adjust the values and drive out the format or the specific value that you're looking for. All right, so we have a SAM account name, and because we know that the user ID being part of this is going to make it unique, I'm not going to worry about adding additional methods here in this particular series. So for the next name, UPN, or the user principal name, that generally is going to follow the same account name. So if you're not super familiar with Active Directory, typically these two usernames are going to be fairly similar, if not exactly the same. The only real difference is that a user principal name has a domain name on the end of it. So what I'm going to do is actually copy the same account name. I'm just going to rename it really quick. So we'll do user principal name. And you'll see that the methods actually carried over. So we actually have the same value coming out for user principal name right now. And instead what I want to do though is I want to tell NIM, hey, throw a domain name on the end of this. And so just like we added the value at the beginning of our last name here, that period, I'm going to do the same thing to our user ID, but I'm going to do add at end instead. So here in the argument, I'm going to do at t4edemo.com. We'll click off and we'll see this get updated, right? So again, we see our iterations. Now our iterations don't need to change because they're always going to be unique, but we do see that up here in the value as well, the difference between what the SAM account name will look like and what the UPN will look like. All right. So for UPN, or sorry, not UPN, the CN value, we're going to do something similar. I'm going to copy the same account name one more time, and we're going to rename this to CN. And then instead of doing first name dot last name and then their ID for this, we're going to add a little bit different punctuation. So I'm going to change this from a period to a space. And we could also use things like add blank at beginning as well. So we have some shortcut options here. Either one works. It does the exact same thing. And then I'm also going to do the same thing at the end of the, or at the beginning of the user ID. So I'm going to do an add at begin, and I'm going to do space. We could also change this up and maybe do something like space dash space like that. So we get a little bit more kind of formatting going on here, a little bit more distinction between the user's name and their ID. So I think I'll stick with this one. This one I think is a little bit easier to read. All right, so we have our three names here, and we've told NIM how to go about generating the values. The last thing that I want to cover in this particular video is the setting up uniqueness constraints on each one of these. So we've told NIM, here's how to make some random name called ng same account name. But what we need to do is be able to tell NIM when you generate this, what NIM should go check against in order to determine if this is actually unique, or if is this the next available value. And so if we go to the uniqueness tab here, we can select our name. So we'll do this for each one of these three values that we're generating. So I'll start with same account name, and I'm just going to filter this down to same account names, and I'm going to check the boxes for the values that I want to check this against. So because we're creating AD accounts, I want to make sure that this is going to be, this is not going to interfere with any other user objects or any other group objects. All right, I'm going to do the same thing for CN. Just check the boxes, and then the same thing for user principal name. Perfect. All right, we can go ahead and hit save now. And just to kind of recap, what we did in this video is we've created a filter that told us who needs to be created. We now have set up additionally the name generator on how to create the same account name, the CN, and the user principal name. And we told NIM how to make sure that those values are kept in sync, or kept iterated to make sure that they're not going to interfere or conflict with an existing value. On the next video, what we'll look at is setting up our password generator, and then finally taking all of this data that we have, creating what's called a mapping inside of NIM. And that mapping is how we're going to take this data and kind of template out what an account should actually look like, and we'll see accounts get created in Active Directory.